at the analytics.
So you know what they used to always say to me, why don't you smile more? Why don't you laugh more? And I said, you know what I laugh? When someone tells me a funny joke. I'm not just going to...
Do you get the sense that he cares about any of this?
No.
I don't think he cares about anything.
I don't think he cares about
He cares about horses.
What is patois?
Look it up.
How do you even spell patois?
Yes, I already knew you didn't know that one.
I thought it was patois, P-A-T-O-I-R. I Googled it, and it pulls up Urban Dictionary, a stupid Frenchman who is a Boy Scout and has sex with a moose.
What?
So how do you spell patois?
I know it's stupid. I don't care.
Like, come on.
And you know why there's pressure on you, pal? You know why there's pressure on you? Because you've never gotten out of the second round.
Welcome to a special edition of the Daily Ding here on the Athletic NBA Show podcast. We're going to talk about the Houston Rockets today, who I think are one of the more interesting teams as we head into free agency, mostly because they have so much money to spend. $64 million in cap space, burning a hole in their pocket. And to talk about that, the only person that I'd want to talk to about the Rockets is my guy, Kelly Iko. Kelly, what's up, man?
What's going on, man? Just staying hydrated, trying to prepare for what figures to be a very busy period. So,
yeah,
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm great. I'm doing great. I'm ready for free agency. It's not the most exciting crop of free agents, but I think there could be a lot of movement that happens in the next few days, and the Rockets will be a part of that. Let's rewind. Let's touch the NBA draft real quick, because the Rockets had, if you just stack up talent, they probably are bringing in the most talent from the draft. Right. You're talking about Amen Thompson at 4, and then in your wildest dreams, with the most homer Twitter take ever for the Rockets, would you have ever dreamed that that the Rockets would come away with Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore in the same draft?
No, honestly, unless they would have, had to trade up a lot and given up quite a lot of capital to get to, be able to pick two probably top 5, top 6 talents in this draft class, because there was a period during this whole pre-draft process where Cam Whitmore was a guy that was actually being argued for at 4.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, the Thompson twins were always going to be, a bit above, guys like Jarris Walker, Taylor Hendricks, Anthony Black, Cam Whitmore. But, because the Houston's process is so diverse and so, expansive, there were good arguments for Cam at 4. So for them to be able to get Amen Thompson and circle back and get Cam at 20, I mean, that's a grand slam of a draft class.
Yeah. I think the fit with Amen makes so much sense. They need somebody who comes at the table. He's big. He's athletic.
He's the leader. Yeah.
Yeah. And somebody who shows quite a bit of maturity too, which is something that I think this Rockets team needs. So I think that's great. And I know that I would have never said hey, don't take Cam if he's there at 20. Obviously you're going to do it. But I do wonder if there's going to be enough room for him to spread his wings a little bit in Houston. Is there any concern about that at all?
You mean for Cam?
Yeah.
So the way I understand it is, in the last 2 seasons, the Rockets kind of threw Jalen Green and kind of threw Jabari Smith into the fire early. Yeah. And part of that is because, of all the chaos that was going on internally, and they were just trying to get those guys on the floor and get them as many minutes as possible. Now, having seen what happens, over the last 2 seasons, they want to take a more calculated approach. So, don't be surprised if you see at times Cam playing some in the G League. Don't be surprised if you see at times, him just getting a gradual taste of the NBA and getting his way to work his way up into Ime's rotation, because now you're bringing on potentially 3 to 4 veterans in this summer. You all already have, the young core of Green, Jabari, Alperen Şengün, Tari Eason. Ime already said that there won't be anything handed out in terms of playing time, rotation time, So for Ahmed and Cam, or Cam specifically, I think there needs to be a specific approach to how you want to ingratiate him into the Rockets lineup, because as you all know, he's very talented, but there were some questions coming into this whole draft, and for him to develop at that right rate and that right amount, it needs to be a hands-on approach. So I would expect them to take their time. Don't rush anything, because you have the benefit of having those guys on your roster at the same time now. So now you can take things slowly and and measured.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think that's probably the right way to handle Cam, whether you took him at 4 or you took him at 20.
Right.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. There's got to be some expectations coming for some of these guys this season, with the young core in particular, with it being Jalen Green or Jabari Smith or Şengün, as we've mentioned. Who is kind of behind the scenes expected to make a leap in this offseason and show up as a better player in the fall?
Jalen Green. I would say Jalen Green, just because if you want to make the argument, he kind of started this whole rebuilding process, them getting him at second overall, and him kind of being the face of this new phase of Rockets basketball. His first 2 seasons in the league, we saw a lot of positives, but we also saw some negatives as well. And I've always said this, but Jalen taking the biggest leap is probably the easiest way for these guys to escape, the doldrums of the Western Conference.
Yeah.
If Jalen can turn into an efficient, 25-point game, 25, 5 and 5 guy in year 3, and actually compete on defense, not only does that raise the floor of your team, because it makes things easier for guys like Amen Thompson. It makes things easier for guys like Jabari Smith Jr. It certainly makes things easier for Alperen Şengün. Now it also raises your potential, because this is a kid that, from an athletic standpoint, there aren't too many in the league that can match up with him.
True.
Explosiveness, drive, power, speed. But, he's still young. He's still adding to his game. He kind of – it wasn't the best 2 years, in the previous regime under Stephen Silas, because at times, you're playing alongside Kevin Porter Jr., who's also trying to become a point guard.
Yeah.
And that can come up with its own, drawbacks and stuff like that. But now with Ime in place and having spent some time with him, up close, he understands, or he should understand, what's expected of him. And, now with you trying to bring on guys that have been there and done that this summer, now that only raises the competition even more. And, guys like Jam that could have felt some, because Frank, if you want to be honest, over the last 2 seasons, he could have felt like he was the top dog. He could have felt like he was, the alpha in the locker room. But now there's been a big shift. So everyone started from ground zero, and this is where the real work comes in.
Yeah. You mentioned KPJ. What's next for him?
I think, and Ime kind of alluded to it, but it seems to me like putting him in more advantageous positions for himself. That means more off the ball work, allowing him to revert back to how he's wired as a scorer and a playmaker second. I will give the Rockets credit for bringing somebody in who had a troubled past and being able to develop him in a way that, even if he's not a primary playmaker, he can still be, a pretty good secondary, a tertiary playmaker. So in the course of a half-court set, he can make those reads, he can make those passes, but his number one option should be scoring.
Yeah.
He's a hell of a catch and shoot guy. He's still athletic, and still, he's skilled. He can drive to the basket, 3-level scorer. But at times, it felt like there was too much pressure on him to control Houston's offense and get guys in the right spots, and also look for his own shot as well. So as a young player, if you're not wired as a natural point guard, it can be hard. And we saw kind of that process of him trying to learn on the fly in the midst of Houston's, mess of a season. Like, it was a disaster. So I do think that now having Ime in place, who understands, that shooting is a premium, and Kevin is a good shooter, bringing in guys like Amen, going out and signing guys like Fred VanVleet, you now have guys that can get him shots and get him easier, more efficient looks. So now the pressure isn't on him as much, and he can, do the things that he does best.
Yeah. So you're hinting at like a 6-man type of role where he comes in off the bench.
Yeah, something like akin to a microwave scorer because he's shown enough where he can go get you 30 if you need to on a given night. He can't he's a good player. Like,
yeah,
I just think that over the last 2 seasons, he didn't particularly benefit from Houston's lack of cohesion and lack of structure. And some of it is on him because they gave him the keys, but you have to give someone the keys under the right circumstances. It has to be the right development. It has to be the right system in place to allow for mistakes, but also give room for growth. And at times that wasn't apparent in Houston, So if you want to put that on him, if you want to put that on Steven Silas, if you want to put that on the front office, whatever. But it has to be for someone like him that comes with his own baggage, it needs to be, all hands on deck type situation. So now moving forward, and he has taken those steps early to kind of speak with Ime, kind of get a clear understanding of his role and what's expected of him moving forward. So he'll be able to contribute in the best way possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Some people might be like, why are you guys spending so much time on Kevin Porter Jr.? But the guy averaged 19, 5, and 5 last year.
Yeah.
He shot the best percentage from 3 of any of the Rockets players.
Yeah. He was arguably the best player last season.
Yeah.
I wouldn't argue with that.
Yeah. I'm very interested to see what happens with him because I can see a situation where either they sign a point guard or they just slide Amen Thompson in as the point guard and they send him to the bench. And I think it will be very interesting to see what his reaction to that is, and how he embraces that role, because he has the talent to embrace a 6-man type of role and be a like Jamal Crawford-esque player that plays in the league for a long time. Or he can go the other way where he can be like Christian Wood, where it's like
ballistic. Because the optics too, because even going back to last season, and this is something I'm trying to see what's going to happen because if you look at the locker room dynamics, like Kevin he inherited James Harden's old locker. And for those who don't know how the locker room is set up, Harden had a double locker, essentially. It's the first one when you come into the locker room, the first one to the right. That was Kevin's locker. So if you're telling me that now he might be coming up, and his name is the one that was called last in in the lineups. So that means, like, for young players, that means something.
It definitely does mean something. That's true.
So if you're telling me now that he could potentially be moved off the ball and potentially onto the bench, how is he going to react to that? If he's going to react how I think he will, then it should be fine. But there's always the chance that it's not.
Yeah. So you can kind of expect it to be. There are 2 draft picks that I think will play, but mostly Amen Thompson in the rotation. Jalen Green, Jabari Smith.
Yeah.
What's the deal with KJ Martin? Is there any expectation for him, Kenny Martin Jr., to be back? Because he was another like really good player for them.
He was. He was, especially as a starter. But he's going through a similar thing to what he experienced last season in terms of logjam. And last year, if you remember, he wasn't happy because they had recently re-signed Jason Tate. They just drafted Tari Eason. Yep. Eric Gordon was still on the roster. So, his camp approached the Rockets in hopes for a trade elsewhere to open up playing time for himself. That didn't materialize. He remained professional. And Eric Gordon was eventually traded, and he started and actually played pretty well. Now, he's back at square one because you draft Cam Whitmore. You're going to sign a wing, and Tari Eason has to play more next season. So you're the odd man out again. So from what I understand, him and his camp are preparing for the, of being traded, in the near future because, for the Rockets, I know that they picked up his option today, but if they trade him, that opens up a bit more, like $2 million more in cap space and that. And it might not mean much on the surface, but if they do sign people to big money and you need to get a little bit more wiggle room, moving KJ makes a lot of sense. So there are a few teams in the West, that are keeping their eyes out for him. So I just think he's the odd man out.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. Especially you're probably wanting to upgrade that position specifically so that you can be better defensively. Okay, let's get to that. $64 million in cap space.
Right.
Potentially $66 million in cap space heading into free agency, which starts tomorrow. What are the names? You already mentioned one in Fred VanVleet. First, walk me through like the Harden optimism, pessimism at the moment.
So right now, as we're speaking, the Rockets contingent, they're going to LA to, they're going to have some meetings, as free agency begins.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I understand, James and his camp, they're prioritizing a move away from Houston. Like at one point, it sounded like it was going to be a fairy tale emotional return.
Yeah.
The Rockets had they have the most cap space, and theoretically they could offer him the money he's looking for. But from what I understand, they're not willing to do that. They have to fill out their roster. Like they can't just give you $52 million out of their 60s. Like that makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
So, James is probably going to stay in Philly, but for Houston now they can shift their attention to a Fred VanVleet, guys like that, because Ime still wants people that are respectable, that command respect in the locker room, that can bring cohesiveness and structure, but he wants winners at the end of the day. And Fred is a champion. He's been to the NBA Finals. He's won the NBA Finals, and he's one of the game's best primary ball handlers that we have today. So all that makes sense. He can come in and from day one change that locker room on its head, because Fred commands accountability. People that play with him, they'll attest to the fact that he is a guy that when he talks to you, you listen. So that aligns incredibly well with what Ime wants to do. So, the VanVleet thing makes sense for sure.
So what's the money look like to pry him away from Toronto or from anybody else? I mean, he'll have other suitors, but the Rockets are going to have so much money to throw at him. What's a number that you have heard that makes sense for him?
So as far as specifics, I haven't heard like the actual to the contract, to the dollar amount for him, but I do know that for Houston, they're going to have to go above market value. The whole point of you having all this cap space and being able to flex this financial freedom is, you're going to have to overpay to get some of these guys. Like, let's be honest, they're not coming into a winning situation. There's definitely better opportunities elsewhere. So if you want to bring them to Houston, not only do you have to, convince them of the project, you got to convince them that, well, I mean, there is a plus in coming to Texas because of the no state income tax, but
yeah, sure.
You are coming into a situation that's been the worst team in the NBA for 2-3 years. So, for guys like Fred, for guys like Dylan Brooks, for guys like whoever they want, they know they're going to have to overpay. That's just the reality of the NBA now. And with the new CBA stuff in place, teams are trying to circumvent the cap and trying to find loopholes and stuff like that. But the Rockets are going to have to be super aggressive, and they're going to have to be super aggressive in a short amount of time because it's 30 teams in the NBA.
So give me some more names. Dylan Brooks is one that we've heard a lot. I can see how that would work. He's a good defender. Right. He's played on winning teams. Like that makes sense. Who else is out there that like maybe Rockets fans are like saying, hey, we should really get this guy?
Bruce Brown is the guy that the Rockets extremely like. If I was to put him in a tier, I would put him right below that first tier of guys. Right outside the VanVleet, Dylan Brooks, Brook Lopez, I'll put Bruce Brown, Cam Johnson, right below. Now Cam is a bit difficult because he's restricted, and the Nets probably want to keep him. Obviously up to a certain amount, but Bruce is a guy they like for sure. He brings a lot of stuff to the table. He's a winner. He's versatile. Although he's not a traditional point guard, he can play. He can, as you've seen over the last 2 seasons, he can play as a small ball roller, or he can play off the catch and space the floor and defend your team's best player. So there's a lot of reason that those guys like him a lot. Cam Johnson as well. He's more of a prototype, forward, can guard 1 through 4. He's an excellent shooter. His game is a bit stiffer than you'd like in terms of just that fluidity, but still on a young enough timeline as well. Austin Reeves is another name as well. That fits a lot of what they do, especially from an age perspective. He's a hard-nosed guy, culture guy. He's going to bring that grit. He's going to demand kind of that worker's mentality that you're looking for. Guys like that as well. So another name that they had liked before but is gone was Naz Reid, but the Timberwolves already picked him up.
So let's say that VanVleet just decides to re-sign in Toronto. He's comfortable there. Like Reeves stays, Harden stays. Where does this cash go then? Like, where do you think that they spend all this money? Because it seems like they're wanting to spend this money. They want to improve the roster now. But if like those primary guys are gone, and which I think is actually a blessing in disguise, because that allows you to let your young guys develop a little bit more and maybe just sign maybe role players to put around them, rather than giving them like some primary guy that's going to take touches and shots away from the supreme talent they have. But what happens then? Like, what's like option B, C, D, do you think, for this squad?
So there's two routes, I think. From what I hear, they're pretty optimistic of also trying to get a meeting with Kyrie, in the next few days.
Okay.
So that could be a name to watch as well.
How do you feel about that?
Ooh, I mean, he's one of the greatest point guards this game has seen.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of stuff he brings with him in terms of he also commands respect. Some of the off-court stuff is kind of distracting, but he seems to have put it behind him. And at the end of the day, he's a winner, and he wants to, do great. The only thing is that his health is a question mark because he's gone through a bit of an injury spell recently. But aside from him, there are other guys that they're looking at. Another guy I think I saw that he's opted in was Jordan Clarkson.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's probably staying in Utah. So it's kind of thin. Like, I mean, they like Donnie DiVincenzo. They like guys like Mike Conley. But another one of their plan, like they had another thought in terms of their pre-draft, pre-free agency planning, was that if they don't get a point guard, could you go get a guy like a Bruce Brown that you could put a bit off the ball and still allow guys like Amen, to get as many touches as he needs to develop. So they can go a number of ways.
That I would like. That I would like a lot, because I think that if you want your young guys to be superstars,
right,
you got to let them go through it a little bit. And I know that the patience is wearing thin in Houston, and I get that. But
speaking of that, that was another angle to the James thing, because I heard that he caught wind of Jalen's podcast on with Paul George, and he wasn't too keen on some of the things that Jalen was saying, because this is a guy in James that came multiple summers to Houston and took him under his wing and kind of mentored him and kind of worked out with him. But and for him to say, it could be good, it could be bad. He didn't like that very much. But it's a podcast, man.
That's amazing. Okay, so let's say that everything goes the way of the Rockets this summer. They get the guys they want. They head into next season. What does success look like? Because the Western Conference
is loaded.
Is so tough. I mean, Utah got better this past week.
Right.
OKC is going to get better just because they're getting older.
Yep.
All these bottom feeder teams. I think San Antonio is the only one that I think would be bad, but they just got one of the best prospects in the NBA. So how do they manage to get to where they want to go? And what does success look like for Houston next year, even if everything goes their way?
If everything goes Houston's way, the only way that I would consider a real success, and I think they do as well, is to either make the play-in tournament, or the playoffs, or just being in that vicinity. Like, they can't have another season with less than 30 wins. There's going to be a lot of changes if that happens.
Yeah,
frankly speaking, because you can't have built up all this financial equity, and you go out and get the guys that you've been talking about for months. You want to bring in winners, you want to bring in veterans. You can't do that and then have a year where you finish less than 30. Like, that's not going to be acceptable by any means. So I think this phase 2 that they keep talking about, I think it aligns with returning to the postseason. So getting to the play-in, being within the earshot of the play-in or something like that.
Yeah. And when you mean changes, does that just mean Raphael Stone? Or does it
just means like top to bottom? Like, honestly, like if they have another season of 25 games, I could see a lot of changes in a lot of places. Like, so
yeah,
I think there is, I wouldn't call it pressure, but it's expectations, strong expectations for them to have, some significant improvement this season.
Go read Kelly at The Athletic. He's always got great info about the Rockets. Go listen to his podcast. Can you find it on like Apple Podcasts as the Ecosystem? Is that what you search for? Ecosystem Podcast. Go listen to it. It's great. He has lots of great guests on it. Stay tuned in to the Athletic NBA show. Nerd as She Wrote will drop tomorrow. We'll have a Slam and Jam episode recapping day 1 of free agency. That will be on your podcast catcher early Saturday. So stay locked in to the Athletic.
Sure.